follow up on
Sure.
the issue. The former vice president of the College of Republicans, this is good news, is using the WSU Political Science Club as a forum for peaceful, nonviolent discussion of conservative political views.
Yeah.
We have to praise that sort of effort.
I didn't quote it, but the poll that talks about the majority of millennials believe that hate speech should be prohibited and is not protected. 25% of the young people who were polled in that poll said that violence is an acceptable response to hate speech, which I think is terrifying.
I was just going to touch on the Charlotte, like that Charlottesville.
Yeah.
Where's the line when they show up armed to the nines? When they show up armed and the peaceful anti-protest is not, and we're like that's inciting violence. That's agitating violence. If you're going to show up with a fully loaded semi-automatic weapon with batons and everything, and then they jump in and start beating peaceful protesters.
Well, that's a crime. I mean, when you started enacting or acting out violence, you're going to get arrested, and a lot of them, not enough, in my opinion, but many were arrested. But this is the collision, the constitutional collision. The law says they can carry.
I know, but if they show up like that, shouldn't there be more protections in place?
Well, that's a law enforcement issue. Yeah, should you do more to prevent violence from breaking out? Sure, but that's not the speech issue. And it's the collision of First and Second Amendments. In Idaho, they could show up with bazookas, and that would be considered appropriate. It's not in and of itself a threat to be armed in public. Hell, I've got students in my classroom who are packing heat, so I'm not dismissing your point. When you cross the line and start hitting people or charging into groups, then the cops try to arrest you. And there are lots of disputes about whether they were effective or not, or whether they were doing as much to deal with the white supremacists as the counter-protesters. But you've got to admit, there are times when I look at some of the counter-protesting and I think we're doing the work for them. Because that kind of violence against violence doesn't serve our ends if we're advocating for speech and not violence. But that's what we're in right now. That's what we're living in, polarization.
There was a report on NPR, I remember this week or last week, that more than half of the radio stations in the U.S. are owned by a single company, and that company also owns many of the newspapers.
Thinking of Sinclair, which is TV, not newspapers. They have some newspaper properties, but they are becoming the largest private licensee for television stations. It's a family-owned company. They're all over the country. They have bought into the Northwest in the last couple of years. They dominate the Seattle, Portland, and Eugene markets, which is ironic. Highly conservative. The head guy, the lead conservative, who makes Rupert Murdoch look like a flaming liberal, has rules for all their newscasts, and they produce centrally produced political commentary, which has to be carried on the newscasts of all their TV stations, so 115, I think, at this point, and counting. They're trying to buy more. And
Lewiston Station.
pardon?
Lewiston Station.
Lewiston Station too. Yeah. They produced anti-Obama infomercials that were had to be run on all of their stations. They are an interesting threat, political threat, but they're protected. They're protected by the Constitution and by the licensing rules of the FCC. Media consolidation is an issue where the First Amendment can be set aside, and that's a congressional issue. Congress in the past has enacted rules on media consolidation, whether it's cross-ownership of TV and newspapers or consolidation of radio or television companies. But under the Trump administration, nobody expects the FCC or the government to step in on Sinclair, so they're just going to keep acquiring stations.
What about anti-monopoly?
Well, that requires federal action, and you've got a Republican Congress, and Donald Trump has just packed the FCC, so nothing's going to happen in the time that Donald Trump is president. Not to Sinclair. He'd like to take the licenses away from stations the networks don't fundamentally own stations. NBC, CBS, and ABC do have a few network-owned stations that are licensed through the network, but mostly the stations are licensed independently. And FCC can't take away their licenses for political reasons either, at least not yet. Yeah.
You know, when you were talking about Nazi Germany, I always remember reading that Hitler gave every house a radio so that he could broadcast.
Yeah.
And it seems like every time there's a technology communication convulsion, there's a societal convulsion. And the fact that the internet is on our phone has brought this into everybody's house. So when I listen to those poll reports, it seems like people are just trying to say, make it stop. You know, this is, I can't live like this. Can
Too much.
Stop. And I don't know how this is going to resolve. I mean, it seems.
Nobody knows. Are you all following the hearings, the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearings?
We didn't hear the
Yes.
question.
She was talking about the impact of the internet. Technological upheaval always creates social and political upheaval, which is true. But the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee meeting hearings yesterday, today, and I guess they'll continue tomorrow, into social media networks, Facebook, Twitter, Google, even though it's not a social media network, and their role in fake news / Russian propaganda. You need to be following those hearings. This is the next free expression, First Amendment battleground. If Mark Zuckerberg has insisted that Facebook is a technological platform, it's not a media company. And yet a majority of Americans now get their news from their Facebook feeds. I do. My news now comes in through Facebook. And the argument that they're not a media company is a really important argument, because as a technological company, he's got actually more freedom to manage that company in the way he sees fit. If it becomes a media company, then media rules, regulations, and First Amendment protections begin to apply, and he loses some authority. So one of the things you're going to see in Congress is an attempt to redefine Twitter, Facebook, and other social media as media companies, subject to the extent there's regulation, but also subject to First Amendment protections. Who knows? But yeah, we're in this point of social upheaval due to social media and the internet. Nobody knew it was going to look like this. Mark Zuckerberg didn't know it was going to look like this. Did you see yesterday Al Franken?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, he says the Russians are buying thousands and thousands of ads with rubles, and you don't realize that something's going on here. Rubles. That's funny.
I think it's an interesting note. You cited some statistics from the museum, and just a couple months ago, the CEO of the museum stepped down, and they're talking about having to move out of their primo location in downtown DC because they can't afford the rent and they're not getting enough visitors.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk about better citizenship among younger generations and understanding our democracy, that's another avenue that we're really missing out on is when we devalue cultural institutes, when we make them luxury items, we take away the urgency to know that information.
How many of you have ever been to the museum in DC? It's a great thing, right? The museum was actually a product of the Freedom Forum Foundation, which was Gannett newspapers. And in 2008, when the newspaper industry collapsed, the financial underpinnings of the foundation collapsed, and the museums never recovered. There's just not the money there used to be to support that location. It may close entirely altogether, which would be a terrible shame. It's a wonderful facility.
Especially when compounded by the defunding of the NEH and the IMLS and NEA and all of these
All the
agencies
others.
that are supposed to prop up the humanities and civics education.
Yeah, no question about it. That would be such a crime to lose the museum. It's wonderful.